I saw this ad on Facebook for free tadpoles, and it was put up by a nursery who used them for a project, but there was only 4 left alive. So I knew I had to have them. And because I don't know the species of frog, it's going to be a surprise when we get the end. In order to keep them though, I needed a second-hand paludarium which had space in the bottom for water. I didn't want it to all be water however, so I was going to put a baffle in to stop the water going across so we could have a land section, and I marked it out and siliconed it up. Running my fingers along the seams to make sure they're all nice and tight, but I let it go and it started to move, so it needed a couple clamps just to keep it in place while I cured. And voila, it held water. But after the water test, we immediately drained it down again, because we needed to put our substrate in first. And in order to see these quite black tadpoles on a black background, I was using white and brown stones, just so there was enough contrast that we could see them. The terrestrial side, however, was a bit more complicated, and we're going to add some clay beads to create a drainage layer, so the soil never became sodden. And to divide it from the soil, we added a little bit of weed barrier. We could then add our mix of sphagnum moss and cocoa fibre. This would hopefully retain moisture and reduce mould inside of the paludarium. I tried my best to scape the paludarium a little bit, but it was all going to get covered in plants anyway, so it didn't really matter. This rather boxy paludarium needed a bit more fluidity to it, and we're going to add that with hardscape, adding driftwood and sticks where we could. And I was hoping once the tadpoles had grown up, they'd perch on these little sticks. And on the aquatic side, I had a couple sticks going into the water to imitate roots. With the hardscape in though, it was time for the plants, and we were going Tradescantia mad, adding Tradescantias everywhere I could. These were cuttings, but they'd take really easily, and they'd love the humidity of the paludarium. And speaking of humidity, we could also add a type of tillandsia called Spanish moss that would take all of its moisture from the air. Then I added a couple viney plants. Now these would hopefully give it a bit more of a jungly vibe and spread out through the paludarium. For one of the highlight plants, I was going to add a Monstera delicioso albo variegata. Whilst it would take up a lot of the paludarium, I thought they were so cool, and I also put a Thai constellation in there as well. I filled in the last few nooks and crannies with some Java fern and some Anubias. Whilst these were aquarium plants, they'd grow immersed in the humid environment. With the planting done, there was only 1 or 2 more steps for us to do before we could add our creatures. Once I'd added the water, I could see there was a little bit of detritus in it, but I wasn't too worried, because it would settle out by itself. And whilst we added water to the aquatic side, we also had to add it to the terrestrial side, filling up the drainage layer underneath to keep everything moist, but not sodden. In order to make sure the aquarium water was clean and warm, we had to add a pump and a heater. And I did my best to hide the wires so we wouldn't see them when the paludarium was actually done. It was now time for our first inhabitants, and we wanted something that would clean the paludarium and act as a snack for the frogs, so tropical orange woodlice were the perfect bet. These cute, inquisitive creatures started walking around their new habitat immediately, trying to find food, I imagine. But they weren't the only creatures in the darkness. There was actually some English woodlice that had come in on the bogwood where it had been left outside, and I decided to leave them, because they seemed happy as well. In a rainforest you need rain, and that's what we did next. adding a sprinkler system to keep everything moist throughout the day. The sprinklers cause rain droplets to form on the plants, and it was mesmerising to watch them fall. And these rain droplets would make sure our frogs didn't desiccate and they could live happy long lives. In the future, this rain might actually trigger the frogs to breed, as they see the water splashing against the top of the aquatic side, recreating a tropical storm. And with one final task, I added some Indian almond leaves to the water. They'd add tannins, and they'd reduce any chance of fungal infections in the tadpoles. And, well, these are the tadpoles! We had 4 quite large tree frog tadpoles. We didn't know what species they were, or when they were going to turn into frogs. But for now, we could give them a home. What surprised me were how large their lips were, as they used them to rasp on material to take algae and other biofilms off the surface of rocks. And for such small creatures, they had very powerful tails, moving a lot of water and allowing them to go at lightning speed when they needed to. There was something very human about their eyes, and it made me excited to see how they were going to grow up. To make sure it wasn't too much of a shock, I temperature acclimated them for a couple of hours before we put them in. And what looked like quite big tadpoles before, all of a sudden were very little in their new enclosure. And they must have felt that way too, because they hid in corners and under leaves for the first couple of days. I even saw one getting spooked by an adventurous woodlouse who decided he could swim underwater. Over the next few days, I saw them play in the flow, and I suppose they got more oxygen that way, which would allow them to grow faster. I began to feed them bloodworm, and I thought I'd be clever and put it all in one place so it was nice and tidy, on top of an Indian almond leaf. Things seemingly never go to plan though, and the tadpoles just couldn't find it. They came for the smell, but couldn't actually find the bloodworm. Which left me with one choice: tip it all into the gravel. The sudden movement of water and scent got them excited, and, well, they began scavenging in the gravel. And they seemed to go not of eyesight, but off of taste and feel, shoving their face in every crevice they could find, and even sniffing the leaf they were originally on. To increase the diversity in their diet, I also started adding algae wafers as well. They did really seem to enjoy it, spending hours rasping the same wafer again and again. There wasn't really any discernible features on the tadpoles for me to tell them apart, until one day, one sprouted legs. I first spotted him when he was eating an algae wafer, and he seemed to be so much more advanced than the other tadpoles. I didn't know if this was because he was eating more, or he was just born a little bit earlier, so had now developed, but he had his little legs. He was turning into a froglet, but was still very much a tadpole, mainly swimming with his tail and not really using his legs all that much. Although he seemed to think that he was ready to get out of the water, almost breaching the surface any time he got excited. He still needed a little bit more time in the water though, and to speed up his growth so he didn't have to wait so long, we added some Daphnia. Now, live food's great for growing tadpoles, so hopefully all the others would catch up as well. They weren't quite sure how to eat it to begin with, but the Daphnia numbers slowly dwindled over the course of several days, so they must have been eating it. A week or so later, in the evening, I walked in to a froglet, and from their stripes I could deduce that they were bony-eared frogs, which are a beautiful type of tree frog. And with this discovery, I was actually quite pleased, because they're one of the nicer tree frogs you can get. And he wasted no time climbing out of the water, and began to take his first proper couple breaths. He still had quite a long tail to absorb, so he probably wouldn't eat for a couple of days. So we just had to leave him to it, and he'd absorb it in his own time. Not even a week later, I spotted him on one of the monstera leaves. And all that was left of his tail was just a little nubbin. He could now definitely be classified as a froglet, and he started to jump. But now he didn't have his tail for energy stores, we had to start feeding crickets. I wasn't sure whether he'd be very good at eating them, so I added lots to begin with. And he disappeared for a week or two, until I spotted him again. He was being quite secretive, so I added a bit more food to try to lure him out. And there he was, a perfectly formed tree frog. He spent most of his days hiding in the foliage, but when he was out, I did try to hand feed him. He didn't seem to like the tweezers though, and much preferred taking the crickets off the floor. I wasn't too worried about him starving though, because I did notice little poos on the leaves next to him, so he wasn't going to go hungry. And being such a well-mannered frog, I saw him wash his bum every now and again as well. I think he was potentially one of the most beautiful animals I'd ever kept, and he had such cute little eyes. But any time I wanted to handle him, I had to put on gloves to make sure the oils on my skin didn't damage him. And not long after that, the rest of his friends joined him, and they'd all finished metamorphosizing. And they seemed to enjoy each other's company, hiding with one another. They did mainly sleep in the day, and they came out at night, so some nights I'd turn the light on just to see where they were. When I did this, they froze like statues, like I'd caught them somehow. But it was nice to see them up and about with their eyes open. I thought I'd genuinely been quite successful. We saved these frogs from almost certain death in the hands of people who didn't know what they were doing, and look at them now. It's crazy how these 4 little tadpoles, these aquatic animals, turned into terrestrial frogs over the course of only a few months. And I was pleased with what I'd achieved. So, I'll see you next time.